last week, I tried to get through as many of the characteristics and pieces of information, names about Satan, things that are used biblically to describe him. And we're going to get into some areas here tonight that I just realized I don't have my notes up here. We're going to get into some areas here tonight that will help us get a little bit further. Bergen, when is going to teach next week, and he's going to take us in a little bit different area of, maybe I better let you tell me.
So next week, we're going to still be looking at Satan, but I want to really focus on how he relates to God. So we'll be looking at who God is in relation to Satan and vice versa. And so that's the way we're going to be proceeding next week.
I did it. I stepped out of the line of sight. In this history of Satan, and as we talk about it, this is kind of redundant for us, what we're saying here. That the basic understanding is, despite all that Satan is, all that he does, we know that there's only one eternal and self-existent God who's the creator of all things. If Satan was not a created being, then he must be eternal or self-existent. And we talked last week about this idea of dualism, that you can't have the two God figures. And so all that is incompatible with what we believe and what we read in the scriptures. Now, Satan, as we mentioned earlier, and some of this is a little review, was a fallen angel. In Colossians, I'm going to be asking you to read some things out of the Bible here in a little bit, so get your books out. In Colossians 1:16, and you can read it, but I'll touch on it. For by him, God, all things are created, both in the heavens and on the earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created by him and for him. Now, when we start talking about Satan and we start looking at whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, it's not that we're going to be looking exactly tonight about all the areas that Satan may have an impact over. But he is the chief of the fallen angels. Now, we have Michael as a good angel, if you will. Can you think of any other angels that were named in the New Testament, Old Testament? Gabriel? Can you think of any others? They're the only two. They're the only ones I know. Yeah.
Maybe it's in the Apocrypha or somewhere. Raphael is a name that comes from somewhere. I believe it's from the Catholic. Maybe from the Apocrypha. Maybe it might be one of those books, but I know that they believe in an angel Raphael.
Yeah. For what we're dealing with, the Old New Testament, I only know the two. And you're right. But the Catholic Church and even some other Christian religions refer to other angels. So in Ezekiel, if you want to look at this, somebody last week said, can you send me this? Because I want to look at the before and the after. I want to see this in context. Well, I can't put the whole chapter of Ezekiel up there. And so if you want to look, you can look at the context before. Somebody want to read, let's read that out loud. Anybody want to try and read that?
Ezekiel 28:15-17.
Right.
You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until unrighteousness was found in you. By the abundance of your trade, you were internally filled with violence and you sinned. Therefore, I've cast you as profane from the mountain of God, and I have destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom by reason of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I put you before kings that they may see you.
Okay. We look at this and we say, this is about Satan. And from this, look at some of the things that we find out about him. What can you tell about Satan from this? He was a guardian cherub. He had a role. What else?
He was blameless for a while.
Blameless for a while.
Very violent.
He was filled with violence. I destroyed you from the midst of the stones of fire. And so this gives us a hint of where he is and what's been created for him. But his heart was proud. Pride, because of his beauty, and it corrupted his wisdom. How did that pride of his beauty corrupt his wisdom?
Being selfish.
Selfish.
Better than his creator.
Yeah, you're sure the worship that God had. When people worship, you know, when he's talking to Christ, but you can get that, you know, that he would want to be worshipped too.
Exactly. I want to read something from C.S. Lewis. And he wrote a letter to a lady in 1954, and this is from that letter. He said, "One doesn't even want to be cured of one's pride because it gives pleasure. No, generally, man doesn't say, I don't want to feel good about myself. I don't want to be filled with pleasure because of something I did or something I am." And he goes on to say, if there's an itch, one does want to scratch, but it's much nicer to have neither the itch nor the scratch. As long as we have the itch of self-regard, we shall want the pleasure of self-approval. But the happiest moments are those when we forget our precious selves and have neither, but have everything else: God, our fellow humans, animals, the gardens, and the sky. Instead, we keep pride. And I think that was pretty telling right there. You know, we can talk about not wanting to be pride, but wanting to be selfless. It's pretty hard, isn't it? When I taught at Lubbock High, the teachers all had to stand out in the hallway and make sure that the kids weren't up to no good in the hallways. And we'd watch them walk down the hallways, and I'd stand there with a couple of the other teachers, male teachers, and particularly guys who wanted to wear their draggy drawers and all that other kind of stuff, or bizarre hairdos and all kinds of things. And I'm not saying I'm pretty or dressed right or anything else, but I'm just saying, we'd look at them and say, man, did they actually wake up and stand in front of a mirror and say, this is good. And it just boggled our minds. We were saying, there's pride. And then there's ignorant pride. And we would analyze them. Sometimes we even had contests to see who could shock us the most each day.
I think the prouder somebody is, the harder it is to get them to see that they're not as wonderful as they think they are. But when they're so proud, they won't even consider an opposing opinion. The only thing they like to hear is somebody that agrees with them and is stroking their ego. And heard that we always need to think that the person that we're talking to knows something that we could benefit from, but they would seldom want to do that, because if they didn't think of it first, it's not worth knowing. And it's hard to get through that and help them see there's benefit in admitting that you don't know everything.
You could have been a high school teacher. I don't think
was
we're
too
so
proud.
negative about teenagers. Okay. Now in Isaiah, you might want to try reading that for us. Either that or you watch my balls talk back for you want.
You have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn. You have been cast down to the earth, you who once lay low the nation. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly, on the uttermost heights of Mount Zephyr. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to the realm of the dead, to the depths of the pit. Those who see you stare at you. They ponder your fate. Is this the man who shook the earth and made kingdoms tremble? The man who made the world a wilderness, who overthrew its cities and would not let his captives go home.
Okay. Again, we read this and we say, that is exactly Satan. But this is where we want to pause a little bit and look at those two and say, are they about Satan? Remember I told you about context.
Isaiah says that it's talking about Babylon.
One is Babylon,
The other was Tyre.
and Tyre, right? So Ezekiel was Tyre, and Isaiah is talking about Babylon. And the references here, even the mountain Zaphon was a mountain where they had their gods, and it over the centuries became a place where people would deliberately go there to challenge the gods of Zaphon. And in fact, there's one man who some consider a saint, who for 40 years stood in a tower on that mountain and prayed to God and lived his life as a sign that Zaphon is not. I mean, that's dedication. I mean, he just had a tower and he stood there, and that was his life, dedicating his life to God and to try and convince people that were coming there for the other stuff that it wasn't. So if you were a literalist, if you took the Bible literally, does it say anything in there about Satan? Do either one of them say anything about Satan?
It says some things that it make it hard for you to think it was talking about a kingdom, like falling from heaven. If heaven is literal, then it's got to be talking about somebody that was up in heaven to fall. But and I don't know what percent, but there's a large percent of Christianity that thinks that's exactly what it's talking about, Satan.
Yeah.
Falling from heaven, and probably the ones that would think it's talking like it says it's talking about Babylon, Tyre. They think, well, I was just studying with another group on Tuesday nights, and they're studying about the book of Daniel and getting into the millennial reign and everything. And that's what they want to do when they come to a place like this. They say, well, you try to figurize everything. And heaven means heaven. Why are you trying to make it mean something else? And you try to point out what it says that it's talking about the kingdom of Babylon. And they say, yeah, but can't you feel the shift that it's talking about? It is talking about Babylon for a while, but then if you'll notice, it takes on a shift where it goes deeper and it's talking about Satan. It's not talking about Babylon anymore. I don't see the shift, but I do see if you're taking every word literal, that I can see why you think it's an angel or some heavenly being. But
if we are, and many of us are raised this way, every time we've heard these scriptures, we were told from the time we were little, that's about Satan.
you even get his name from that scripture, Lucifer.
The morning star, right? Now, when you look at this from a historical perspective of what's going on biblically, the people who were reading this and hearing this, up until this time, Satan wasn't really a word to them. It wasn't a personality to them yet. Some of the research that I've done said that it's worth noting that there's no record of there being these verses being applied to Satan until almost 200 years into the Christian era. And so we can take this way, and then as a result, we tend to say, well, history doesn't count. What was going on at that time doesn't count. The fact that nobody wrote about Satan and this, meaning Satan, for 200 years into the Christian era doesn't count for anything. On the other hand, like I said, there are those who say this is all about Satan. I'm going to postulate something here for you, just a thought as I was going through this. As we study the Bible, as we look at the scriptures in the New Testament, do we not look at things like a wedding feast or two men who are searching for, Dale just had two parables of two men who are searching for something great, and we say that's about the kingdom, and we make application. You can probably sit here and think of things that you say, I was told never to do this because in the story in the Bible, this happened. Right? I'm sure all of you have something that you can relate to with that. I'm just going to throw this out. Instead of saying, this is only history, or this is only Satan, could we not say, this is really about pride? This is really about man. We can make application to man about this. Think of all the powerful men who have been, from Napoleon to name all the other ones who want to have these large empires. I don't want to get political. I could mention somebody in Russia they want to have these large empires, and they have all this power, and they have all the trappings of all that. And I could quote a poem for you from my English teaching about Ozymandias. Any of you know Ozymandias? Nope. Okay, we'll have class afterward and I'll teach you about Ozymandias. It's a poem, and in the poem, the whole point of the poem is it was a statue that was disintegrating. It was a statue made for a man named Ozymandias, who is no longer around. Nobody knows his name or who he is, but there's that disintegrating little statue of him. And how much of our life, and this is just me now, this is not a biblical concept or anything, how much of our life can we, as man, as humans, can we look at these two scriptures and say, it doesn't matter whether it's history, doesn't matter whether it's Satan. It matters because I can be guilty of every one of those things. And I'd like to see it that way. Now that's just my thought. I was sitting there today thinking about that and saying, why would I spend time arguing one or the other? We do the same thing with every other scripture in the Bible. And we say, what's the application to us? And so I wanted to throw that out there. Any thoughts? You won't hurt my feelings, I promise.
Because you're right, and the Bible tells us that the lust of the flesh and the boastful pride of life is not from God, it's from the world. So you're right, it does pertain to us in that sense. And whether it was about Satan or only about Babylon, surely a lot of the things that it mentions there, and the reason that we think it's Satan is because it had to have been something similar to that. If he was in heaven with God at one time and then became what we know him to be, pride and a fall from separation from God took place somehow, somewhere. So a lot of it applies to Satan as well as to Babylon and all other great kings and kingdoms. And like you say, the scripture was written for our learning so that we can avoid terrible things that we see that others did and realize it could happen to us too.
Exactly. Okay. Any other observations or questions? None? Okay. As we look at those two scriptures, and obviously there is a debate about the kings or whether it's Satan or the kings. In Hebrews 2:14, it says, because God's children are human beings made of flesh and blood, the Son also became flesh and blood. For only as a human being could he die, and only by dying could he break the power of the devil, who had the power of death. And so in that scripture, that's one of the references there where we get that idea of devil. And it wasn't a real common concept for the early Israelites. I'm gonna say this, and it's gonna be kind of offbeat, and I've already given you one thought that I came up with. I have to understand things a little bit differently than most people probably. Most of you are most of you in here parents? You've had children, okay? So when we have children, and that we start trying to teach them concepts or teach them to be good or bad. How much of it sometimes is not acknowledged behavior, intellectual behavior? My son, for instance, when he was less than 2, would run out in the street and we'd spank him. And he'd run out in the street and we'd try and do something to hold him back. He'd run out in the street and we kept saying, "You're going to get killed." He had no concept of cars coming down the street. He just wanted to run. He had the behavior, but he didn't know what he was doing or why or the result of it. We had to teach him that. Now, we were not good parents because one day there was a horse that got killed on the highway near us. And even though he was young, right about 2, I guess, we drove him out and we stopped and showed him that mutilated horse and said, "That's what happens when you run in the street." Now, did he understand it? Nope. But I had to keep trying to teach. And as they grow, fortunately now, my son's 42 and he calls us and says, "You know, I don't know how you were parents. I don't know how you raised 3 kids. I have trouble taking care of my dog." And I say, "You don't even begin to understand until you have something beside a dog and you're trying to teach that." Now, in my mind, here's where my analogy goes. When God started with man, and I'll just start with, let's say we start with Israel. They didn't really have, they had a concept of maybe God possibly, but they needed to learn. And they were babies. In a religious sense, they were babies. Some of the stuff that they could have been given by God, some of the information that they could have been, they wouldn't have been able to really comprehend it. As a people, as they grew, do we not see growth in them as a nation? They reach a period where they're like teenagers and they want to go off and dabble with other gods and do things that their father says they shouldn't do. But as they get older, we say, "Okay, now you're ready to try and understand the plan. Now you're ready to try and understand, as God, what I'm trying to do with you as a people, as humanity." And he begins to reveal, particularly in the New Testament, all the information we need as adults. Now, I don't want to belabor the analogy, but as my son gets older, as you as a young parent grow with your children, don't you read books and say, "I want to be a better parent"? Don't you go to Dewey's class and learn about love and logic? Don't you try and find out ways to be the better person so that you can use your wisdom to guide? God, some of these concepts that we're talking about with Satan and all that, I don't think mankind, this is me, I don't think mankind was ready. If you would have told them about a Jesus, and here's what's going to happen with Jesus, and I think you can find scriptures. Did the Jews, when Jesus came, and they had all the teaching of the Old Testament, did they get it? No, they weren't ready yet for that kind of knowledge. And so we find that kind of teaching about Satan the same way. And You correct me if I'm going way down wrong. This is just, like I said, my opinion on that analogy. I don't think that the Israelites could handle all the knowledge that they needed to know about Satan. And that's why we hear more about it in the New Testament than we do in the Old Testament. I didn't know whether you had something to say.
I just think about demon possessed people in the New Testament they're talking about.
Now, we could get into all kinds of things like the witch at Endor and you know, and all kinds of things where we talk about witchcraft and stuff like that. But all that was condemned by God. Okay. So just touching back on it. Historical personages, those kings that we're talking about in the historical version, are just that, and they fade and they pass. The references to Satan are something that we can deal with, that we relate to, and they become something that is a tool we use to help guide ourselves. And like I said, I think the message can be timeless and applicable to all. So let's talk a little bit about his position. Satan had unparalleled wisdom and beauty. We saw in verse 12 and 13 that he had, I asked you some of the things about him. He had unparalleled wisdom and beauty, which ideally is what gave him his confidence. He had unparalleled habitation. Now, again, we get into the, oops, one of them. We get into, was Satan created? If he is a created being, when were all the beings created? Would it have been before Eden? And that's where we get our idea that Satan was the snake in Eden, right? He could have been there, and the snake could represent something else. But we tend to say that the snake was literally Satan. Now we go back to the word. What does Satan mean? Was the snake literally the person, the snake, or was he the influencer? Or did he use the snake to influence? It was a unique place. Now, he had a dazzling, the description of his dress or robe indicates something of the glory that was bestowed on him. In Genesis 3:24, it says he belonged to the order of angelic creatures designated cherubims. Anybody in here a cherubim expert? No? Probably you're now, but you should. You know what they say?
Cherubims around the altar.
Hmm?
What it said was the cherubims around
And they were protectors. So is it possible that he was put in Eden eventually to be, originally to be a protector? Possibly. So I keep pressing the wrong button. So he was on the holy mountain of God, and he walked in the midst of the stones of fire, likely references to the presence of God himself. Satan was the chief guardian of God's holiness and majesty. He had a very, very powerful and important position. He also had unparalleled. You're welcome to come on in.
Sorry about that. We're walking all over town trying to get some word in.
Well, we got some of that over here. Okay, and so he was perfect in the sense that he was completely sound and having total moral integrity. And he was created, but he did change. He was cut down to earth. He fell. That's the falling star. It describes the character of his sin as a rebellious ambition which was totally contrary to the creature who owed all that he was and had to the Creator. This whole idea, I'm going to cut the finger off. That ambition, that based on his pride, and we go back to what we were talking about in Ezekiel and Isaiah, that pride probably is one of the root things that causes us all the most problem in life. When we do get prideful, it does cause us problems. And that being selfless and that humility is the thing that is so hard. That's what we try to attain. Yes, sir.
Just listening, in your case, as a public school teacher yourself, and also in my Bible classes with young people, something always sparked a little bit of interest because of some of the young people who think they know it all, And a statement that I sometimes would make is that the beginning of wisdom is for a person to understand their own limitations. And Abraham Lincoln one time said, "Everybody is dumb, only in different ways." We picked up on that, but I always thought that sparked a little bit of interest in some of a lot of the young people, the pride of life. I've got it made, and I know it all. One thing and then the other.
Exactly. Yeah. It's even more rewarding when later they come back and say something like, "I wish I had listened to you." Or, and by the way, that's rare. So if you get it, it's a jewel. Okay. The rhetorical thing, and I touched on this the last time. How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. That how is an interrogative pronoun. It's usually used in a rhetorical question. And so, like, how in the world could you have, wow, how you have fallen. I saw you when you were this way, and now you're this way. How? Wow. It's that kind of thing. So in Revelation, and again, I'm going to let Bergen get into all the Revelation explanations and what. I don't claim to even know everything about Revelation, but in 22:16, we see that we're alerted to the fact that Satan's plan was to counterfeit the plan of God, and indeed it was and still is. When we talk about angels a little bit, we have time. If you will, turn to Numbers 22, and we'll turn to verse 22 and go through 38. Just want to bring this up as another point. We don't have to read the whole thing. It's a lot of verses. But you know the story. Most of you know the story of Balaam's donkey. And I hope I said that right. I have a Pennsylvania Yankee accent, and I always say donkey wrong. My wife says, "What are you talking about?" And I don't hear the difference. So we have a story. He said, but God was very angry when he went, and the angel of the Lord stood in the road to oppose him. And 3 times Balaam reaches a point where the donkey sees the angel and says, nope. And he tries to avoid the angel. And what does Balaam do?
Beats the donkey.
Beats the donkey. And 3 times he does that. And finally, on the 3rd time, what does the donkey do? He just lays down and says, I'm out. But of course, the donkey in this story talks. And he says, am I not your own donkey, which you have always ridden to this day? Have I been in the habit of doing this to you? No, he said. Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with his sword drawn. So he bowed low and fell face down. The angel of the Lord asked him, why have you beaten your donkey these 3 times? I have come here to oppose you because your path is a reckless one before me. The donkey saw me and turned away from me these 3 times. If it had not turned away, I would certainly have killed you by now, but I would have spared it. Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, I have sinned. I did not realize you were standing in the road to oppose me. Now, if you are displeased, I will go back. The angel of the Lord said to Balaam, go with the men, but speak only what I tell you. So Balaam went to Balak's officials. Now, do any of you in your things have any reference to that angel other than just saying that he opposed him?
That's quite a study all by itself.
Yeah, it is.
Because depends on what you read on it, on the angel of the Lord. Some indications, if you go through their study about that, it might have been Christ.
In some of the versions, that angel that was sent, that angel, that word that was sent there was Satan. If you go back to a deeper study, that angel was a Satan. Now, what's the word in there that refers to the Satan that was sent to Balaam?
Fallen angel.
Yeah. Well, he wasn't a fallen angel. In this case, he was an angel sent by God. But the Satan, what does the word Satan refer to? A what? To oppose. Satan is an opposer. Satan is someone who is going to interfere. He's going to stop. This angel was sent to oppose Balaam because Balaam wasn't doing what he was supposed to do. And so we see that word used, that Satan word, and we tend to not think of the word Satan. Now, again, a lot of this is where the study comes in. When you look at the original language, or you look at what the words really say in the scripture, we get the story and we see the overall story. But sometimes the words are not what we expect them to be. And so when we talk about Satan, Satan is an opposer. But that opposer can be sent by God. Sometimes God doesn't want us to do certain things, and he can send an opposer. So we tend to be myopic with our definition of Satan. And we just say Satan is only red with cloven hoofs and a tail, and he's evil, and he's poisonous, and he's this. But there can be more than one Satan. There could be it's Satan. And we ask for that. We say, God, if I'm getting ready to do something really stupid, would you let me know? Would you guide me? Would you And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for that person to oppose us, someone to stop us, send somebody into our lives to stop us from being our own Satan, full of pride and so on. Now, as a teacher, I always try to look at people's eyes so I can say, did I lose him? Or did I just say something where they're thinking, what is he on? Does that make sense? So I'm doing these first 2 weeks. I warned you at the beginning that I wanted to get across the point to you that some of our perceptions of Satan aren't necessarily sometimes correct, but they're also not necessarily fully understood either. And there's more to this personality, and I'm sure Bergen's going to get into it. There is so much more about this personality, this thing called Satan, the opposer, the destroyer, than what we give credit for.
Bill,
Yes, sir.
I don't know if you're gonna get into the book of Job next week or anything, but in the throne room of God, when all the angels are coming and talking about what they've been doing, you see Satan there with all of the other angels, and God just kind of has a friendly dialogue with him, it seems like, asking him where he's been, what he's been doing, and it's not like you wonder, why does God even talk to this evil being, and why is he with the good angels, and it shouldn't be any kind of relationship at all, we feel like, since we're supposed to shun evil, and we wonder why God doesn't do that, but and we don't have an explanation maybe, but Satan is serving a purpose, and he does what God allows him to do. He has to have permission for all of the difficult or bad things, painful things he does to Job. And so the relationship is more complicated than we usually paint it to be, I think.
Interestingly, I don't want to get into Job right now, but I'll touch on that. How did the children and the other people, how did the crops and things, how did the animals die? Did Satan stab them?
Earthly enemies, warring people, natural
Natural
disasters.
disasters. So remember we talked about the powers and the dominions and Satan can utilize those natural or supernatural elements to cause damage and destruction as well. There were he had 5 wills of rebellion that we can read about with Satan. One was I will ascend to heaven. And we don't want to necessarily spend a lot of time on the 3 different levels. You have the atmospheric heaven, the stellar heavens, and then the heaven of heavens, which is God's abode. And as an anointed cherub and the guardian of God's holiness, he had access to that 3rd heaven. That's your Job reference. He was able to be there, and not simply just to visit like a tourist. He started out differently. He said in Job 38:7, we have a clue. It says the meaning of the phrase is stars of God. I don't know if you have Job open there, but in 38:7. While this could refer to the heavenly bodies that illuminate the night, it most likely refers to Satan's desire to exalt himself to rule over the angelic kingdom as God. He wants to raise his throne above the stars of God. And again, like I said this out to you, I will sit on the mount of the assembly in the recesses of the north. He Satan is saying this. This is what he is going to want to do. The fourth is, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. It's going back to the scripture that we read. In this, down at the bottom, so this third I will of Satan expresses his determination to rule over the affairs of the entire created universe. He doesn't want to be like God, he wants to be God. And then the fifth, I will make myself like the Most High. Now, I put this in here. Note the contradiction in Satan's own thinking here. To become like God was, first of all, to admit that he was not God. He had to say, I'm not God. I want to be like God. He was only a created being who was created by the Creator. And so, in what way then could the creature be like the Creator? How could he be like the most? So his logic, his wisdom, his rationale for what he's doing doesn't even make sense in what he's saying. He says, I'm admitting that I'm less than you, but I want to be you. There's an American theologian, Charles Ryrie. He's actually he was at the Dallas Theological Seminary for a while, among others. And he says, here, his counterfeit is crystal clear. Satan wanted to be like, not unlike God. The name Elion for God stresses God's strength and sovereignty. Satan wanted to be as powerful as God. He wanted to exercise the authority and control in this world that rightfully belongs to God. And because I think I know where you're going, he has a master plan for our destruction. And the essence of that spiritual war is going to be a battle of the mind and the heart. That's what he's fighting for. And to end in Second Thessalonians. And with all wicked deception for those who are perishing, because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. Therefore, God sends them a strong delusion so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. And so we're going to get into eventually Christian living, but you're going to touch on the differences between God and how man fits into all that universe. So, any questions, comments? Yes, sir.
One thing I remember reading, I guess it's in scriptures, but I didn't bring my Bible. I was walking down the street anyway. Satan's objective is still kill and destroy.
Right.
That's straight out of the Bible.
Yeah.
And he's pretty aware of holiness and godliness, but he chose to be against that.
And
He's very apt and good at being bad.
And again, the application here is for us. We don't intentionally go about trying to be Satan-like, but yet it's easy for us living our life to make poor decisions that in fact are the same kind of things that will destroy us. So I appreciate your comments and you being here. You'll never know how. First of all, number one, I'm glad you're here. And number two, I promise you, I do not stand and watch you as you walk out and judge how you dress.